Hi, welcome to our Wednesday devotional. I'm Drew Patton. I'm the pastor at First Baptist Church, Edwardsville. I'd like to thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing Hagar. Hagar is one of those characters that often gets overlooked in the scriptures in our study of the Bible because she plays such a small role in the life of Abraham. Um, Now you may be wondering why we're discussing Hagar instead of Abraham. And for me personally, I like her story, and I like how much her story reflects and connects to the everyday person today. So we're going to discuss Hagar a little bit, and then we're going to make a little bit of application and connect her story to who we are and what we do today. So let's begin with a little background. Hagar was an Egyptian. We know that she was a slave to Sarah. We don't know when Sarah got her as a slave. Maybe she was born into Sarah and Abraham's family as a slave, or maybe she was purchased when Abraham and Sarah went down to Egypt. We just don't know. But what we do know is that Hagar was enslaved. Um, we don't know what her family did. We don't know what class she came from. Um, but we know that after about 10 years of living in Canaan with Abraham and Sarah became desperate for a child. God had promised them that they would have a child, and it hadn't come to pass yet. They hadn't had this child yet. And so Sarah takes Hagar as her slave and makes her sleep with Abraham. Now, we can't even begin to understand what being a slave was like 4,000 years ago. Uh, we can hardly understand what being a slave was like 175 years ago. And we have some pretty good firsthand accounts. But being a slave 4,000 years ago is unimaginable. The work, the hours, the conditions, the beatings, the torture. Um, we just don't know what it was like. It would have been harsh and hard. Maybe Abraham and Sarah were good slave owners, but they still owned slaves. That meant that those people were not free, to the point that Sarah had control over Hagar's womb. Um, to the point that Sarah could force Hagar to sleep with Abraham. And that's not a comfortable thought. That's not a thought uh, that sounds normal to us. Um, but she did. And once Hagar became pregnant, she and Sarah started going at each other. It says that Hagar despised Sarah and that Sarah mistreated Hagar. Says the scripture says that Sarah mistreated Hagar to the point that Hagar ran away. And it was while she runs away, it was during her time of running away, that she meets an angel of the Lord. And this is the point where I think this story is absolutely fascinating, because she meets this angel, and the angel tells her not to run away, but to go back. And then he gives her a prophecy concerning her son, tells her that Ishmael is going to become a wild donkey of a man who is constantly at odds with his family and with those around him. But I think Hagar would have heard not just the negative connotations of such a prophecy. She would have heard also that her son would be free if he was able to be in confrontation with and at odds with those around him. That means that he is a free person. He's not a slave. And I think this is what gives Hagar the hope that she finds. And then ultimately, what she does is she names God here. She calls God El Roi, or the God who sees me. And she is the only person that we know of in Scripture that names God. Everybody else, God gives a name to them and tells them to call him the God who saves, or the God who rescues, or the God who is um, this or that. God gives his own names to people. But Hagar sees God, hears this prophecy, and responds with, God is the God who sees her. She is a lowly slave. She is a person of no importance, no substance, but God sees her in her distress, comes to her, and makes a promise to her. I think this is really where it connects for us, because a lot of the stories in Scripture are of the most important or the most famous people. We get the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We get the stories of Joshua and Moses and David and Solomon. We get all of these stories of famous, important people. But then we get a story like Hagar, and she even takes up almost 2 chapters worth of Genesis in Genesis 16 and 21. And Hagar, being a slave, being given this prominence in Scripture, shows to us that even if we are essentially nobodies, if we're not the most important person in the room, if we're not the most important person in the world at the time, if we don't have the power and the privilege of somebody like an Abraham or a David or even one of the disciples, we still have an important role to play. We're still seen by God. And I think that makes the second connection for us today, in that regardless of who you are, your calling connects with and has a very, very distinct impact on the calling and ability of obedience of other people. I think about my own children. My calling to be in ministry has put my children in a place where they didn't get to choose to be pastors' kids. They didn't get to choose what church they go to as they're growing up. And most people don't get to choose what church they're going to as they grow up. But they didn't get to choose who their friends were going to be. They didn't get to choose whether or not they were going to be in the limelight. That was based on my calling. That was based on my passion and purpose and ministry. And they still have to deal with the consequences of that. Maybe the people around you have to deal with the consequences of what your calling and your ministry are. Even if you're not a pastor or a teacher or a leader in your church, your obedience directly affects the obedience of others, as we see with Abraham and Hagar. Abraham and Sarah did not stay strictly obedient to what God called them to do. And they brought Hagar into the mix. And from there, Hagar had this child. And because she had this child, she and Sarah didn't get along. And then because Ishmael was older and stronger than Isaac when he was born, Sarah gets jealous and kicks Hagar and Ishmael out. And so all of Hagar's obedience and all of Hagar's relationship with God is based off of Abraham and Sarah. So today, the thought I want to leave you with is, whose obedience, whose relationship with God is based on your own? We like to think of ourselves individually, like we're in control of everything about ourselves. But in fact, we're very much in connection with the culture and the family and our community around us. And ultimately, we don't get to be in community, in communion with God alone. We are in communion with God because of and based on the relationships of those around us. So who are you affecting today? Whose obedience are you helping today? Whose relationship with God are you connecting better today? Um, Thank you for joining us. I know this one's been a little bit longer, but I think it's a very important study. I think it's a very important story. And I think Hagar has a lot to teach us. I hope you'll join us tonight for our Wednesday night Bible study where we'll talk a little bit more in depth about Hagar. And I look forward to getting to know you better. Have a blessed day.